The wine fell before she could step back. It came from the beta's hand. Lord Casson, broad-shouldered and wine-dark with satisfaction, tilting the clay decanter sideways with the lazy deliberateness of a man who had done this kind of thing before and found it amusing. The Sirath red, expensive enough that its import tariff alone could have fed the outer village Omegas for a month, spread across the backs of Mira's hands in a wide, steaming sheet. The temperature was wrong for wine. Someone had added heated stones to the serving carafe in the kitchen, the way the high table always requested in autumn, and so what reached her skin was not room-warm liquid, but something closer to a scald. The silence in the banquet hall was immediate, not because of her, because Casson had done it in front of the Alpha King, and no one was entirely certain what the Alpha King would do. Mira did not make a sound. She turned her hands palm down over the stone floor, so that the wine dripped from her knuckles rather than pooling in her palms, and she kept her posture, spine straight, eyes forward at the middle distance, that every serving Omega learned before their first year of hall work was finished. Her uniform, the grey linen dress, and the pale sash of the unranked, absorbed the rest. "Clumsy," Casson said, and reached for the decanter she was still holding. He took it from her, without looking at her hands. The hall remained very quiet. At the head of the long oak table, Theron, king of the Northern Reach, and alpha of the 5 unified packs, set down his own cup. The motion was small, controlled, the kind of small control that everyone who served in Ironhold Keep learned early to read correctly, the way sailors learned to read a particular stillness in water before a current changed. He did not speak. He watched, his eyes, pale grey under dark brows, set in the face of a man built for cold latitudes, white-skinned from a lineage of Caucasian northern wolves who had held this territory for 3 centuries, tracked from Casson's hand to the decanter to the floor. Then, for just a moment, they moved to Mira's hands. She turned her knuckles inward before he could complete the look. An old reflex, not the reflex of someone hiding pain. She had no pain to hide, not from the wine, not from the silver embossing on the carafe's handle that she had gripped bare-handed for the last 20 minutes, not from the temperature that should by any right have left a welt across every pale finger. She simply did not like being looked at. Theron lifted his gaze, said nothing, returned to the conversation his Eastern delegate had been attempting to restart for the last 4 minutes. Casson poured his own wine and did not apologize. Mira retrieved the secondary cloth from her sash, blotted the floor, gathered the dignity of the moment the way she gathered everything, quietly, efficiently, without witnesses caring enough to mark it, and returned to her station at the serving alcove near the east wall. Her hands were dry within a minute, not reddened, not blistered. She flexed them once to confirm, and then she was still. Across the hall, the Alpha King's nostrils shifted almost imperceptibly. She did not see it. She was already watching the water pitchers. That was 43 days before everything changed, 43 days before the word got out that the silver-touched Omega of the outer kitchens had been carrying something no one had thought to ask her about, something that rewrote the political physics of Ironhold Keep in a single hour. 43 days before Theron learned her name, and what her name meant, and what it meant that silver had never once burned her in the 22 years she had been working quietly in rooms where no one looked directly at anything they did not have to look at. But this moment, the wine cooling on the stone, Casson already laughing at something the Eastern delegate had said, Mira steady at her post. This was where it began, not with a look, not with words, with the question no one in that hall thought to ask. Why were her hands not burned? She had known the answer for 22 years. She had kept it the way she kept everything that mattered, close to the body, silent, without complaint. She had been keeping it the way another woman might keep a wound, if the wound had never once hurt her, and she was simply waiting for the moment its keeping became impossible. That moment was 43 days away. She straightened her sash, checked the water levels in the eastern pitchers, and went back to work. In the 4 years before that autumn banquet, Mira had lived inside Ironhold Keep the way a language lives inside a dictionary, present on every page, consulted when needed, returned to the shelf without ceremony. She had come to the keep at 18, following the secondary assignment lottery that distributed unranked omegas across the 5 serving houses every 3rd year. Her documentation listed her origin as the border settlement of Ashfen, 2 days' ride east of the Reach's Wall, a village that most wolves in the capital had never heard of and had no reason to seek out. Her designation in the keep's record ledger was simply Omega, unranked, kitchen and hall service. The ledger had 4 columns: name, rank, designation, and assignment. Her name had been written in brown ink that had faded slightly in the 4 years since, which was not unusual. Most Omega entries faded. Most were not re-inked. She was 22 now, white-skinned, fair in the way of the Ashfen borderlands, a cooler fairness than the porcelain-pure northern wolves, more the tone of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors, in cold, thin light, a pallor that was not delicate but practical. Her hair was ash-brown, worn in a low knot so tight it never required attention during a hall service. Her eyes were the color of bark in wet weather, an indeterminate brown that recorded detail without broadcasting what it found. She was not remarkable in any way that the keep's upper staff had ever thought to remark upon, which was precisely how she had managed to be everywhere important for 4 years without anyone adding a 5th column to her ledger entry. The hidden competence was not dramatic, it was archival. Mira had learned, in her first 6 months of hall service, that the most powerful room in Ironhold Keep was not the throne chamber. It was the records annex off the East Corridor, where the pack's legal agreements, bloodline documentation, territorial boundary claims, and treaty evidence were stored, in oak cases sealed with silver locks. The archivist, old Beta Sereth, had bad knees and could not manage the annex's upper shelves. Mira could. She had begun helping him with the upper reaches on a Tuesday in her first winter, and by her second spring she had read, not stolen, not copied, simply read, every significant document in those cases. She had a memory of the kind that the keep had no category for in an Omega, exact, structural, and silent about itself. She knew which 3 territorial boundary disputes were still technically unresolved and could be reopened by a hostile Eastern pack. She knew which bloodline document had been misfiled under the wrong case heading, and whose claim to a northern estate it would affect if it were ever correctly indexed. She knew the import tariff schedules, the treaty renewal dates, and the name of every wolf in the keep who had signed a secondary agreement that contradicted something they had signed before. She had never told anyone. This was not deception. She had been asked, once, by Sereth himself, whether she could read. She had said, a little, enough for labels and supply lists. He had nodded and returned to his cataloguing. No one had asked again. The silver tolerance was older than the archival knowledge. It was the first thing she had understood about herself that set her apart, and she had understood it at age 4, in Ashfen, when her mother's silver cookpots had failed to mark her hands the way they marked every other child who touched them. Her mother had gone very still when she saw it, not frightened, still in the specific way of a woman recognizing something she had been told to expect, and had hoped, half-heartedly, would not come. Her mother had said, "Do not show anyone. This is the first rule." The second rule, explained over the following years in the careful, quiet way of a woman who had been carrying a secret longer than her daughter had been alive, was, "Silver does not burn you because you are what you are, and what you are is not welcome in the world as it currently stands." Mira had never fully understood the second rule while her mother was alive to explain it. Her mother had died when she was 14, of an ordinary winter illness, the kind that killed border settlement people with a regularity that the capital packs found unremarkable. Before she died, she had pressed something into Mira's hands, a folded piece of old writing, worn at the creases, sealed with a mark that Mira had spent 8 years recognizing before she finally found its match in the Ironhold Records Annex. Not the current king's administrative seal, the old seal, the one that appeared on documents that predated Theron's grandfather. Mira had found the match on a Tuesday afternoon in her second spring, standing on the upper step of the annex ladder, with old Sereth dozing in the chair below. She had held the worn paper beside the open case document for exactly 30 seconds. Then she had folded her mother's paper back along its creases, tucked it back into the hidden pocket she had sewn into the lining of every grey dress she owned, and climbed down. She had not slept well for 3 days. Then she had slept fine. She was practical about the things she could not change. What she could change, she managed. She requested, quietly and through the correct channels, reassignment to banquet hall service, which gave her access to the upper keep on the nights when the Alpha King held court. She did not do this for any dramatic reason. She did it because the banquet hall was adjacent to the records annex, and because the records annex held one more document she needed to locate before she understood the full scope of what her mother's paper meant. She found it in her 3rd year. It was in the wrong case, as she had half expected. She did not remove it. She simply read it, committed it, and returned to serving water and wine to wolves who did not look at her. This was the life she had arranged for herself, and she was neither content nor discontent with it. It was operational. It was sufficient. She had one secret to keep, and she was keeping it. The wine incident with Casson was the first fracture in the operational surface. Not because it hurt her. It had not hurt her. The silver-chased handle had not hurt her. The scalding temperature had not left a mark, but because Theron had looked at her hands, and Theron was not a man who looked at things without completing the look. She had turned her knuckles in time. She was almost certain. The fracture, when it came, did not come from Theron directly. It came from Winter, and from a pup who was not hers, and from the kind of obligation that a woman with her knowledge could not walk away from once it had been placed in front of her. It came 12 days after the wine. The pup was 3 years old, the son of a junior pack keeper, and his recently widowed mate, a woman named Dale, who had been ill since the first frost, and was getting worse. The child was called Fen. He was small for his age. Mira had noticed him in the lower corridors of the keep, because he had his mother's habit of pressing himself against walls when high-ranked wolves passed, the practiced invisible posture of someone raised to understand that small things survived by not being seen. She recognized the posture. She had worn it herself since she was 4. She had no formal reason to involve herself. The keep's welfare system for widowed pack members was thin but present. Someone would have seen to the child eventually. Eventually was the word that had always troubled her. It was a vague duration, and vague durations cost people things they could not get back. Dale's illness was silver sickness. That was the piece that made it Mira's problem. Silver sickness was rare in non-combat wolves. It required sustained exposure at a level that ordinary life did not produce. But Mira had read the supply manifests for the lower keep quarters, and she knew that the piping in the junior pack keepers section had been replaced 2 seasons ago with a cheaper alloy that the quartermaster's ledger described as suitable, and which Mira's archival knowledge told her was an alloy with a silver content high enough to be a slow problem for sensitive wolves. She knew this because the document authorizing the replacement had been misfiled in the annex under a public works heading rather than a health impact heading, which meant the keep's medical staff had never seen it. She had written a note. She had left it in the correct annex slot, where Sereth would find it and be able to put his name on the concern rather than hers, because a note from an Omega service worker about a medical matter would be filed under the same heading as a request for new linen. respectfully, and then not at all. That had been 7 weeks ago. Dale was still ill. So on a Tuesday morning, 12 days after the wine, when Mira found small Fen sitting alone outside the lower keep entrance at 7 in the morning, in a frost that had come overnight without warning, with no coat and shoes that were more recollection of shoes than the thing itself, she made a calculation. The calculation took about 3 seconds. She took off her second service apron, she always carried two, another operational habit, and wrapped it around the child's shoulders. She picked him up. He was light enough that it worried her. She carried him to the lower kitchen, which was warm year-round from the baking ovens, and set him on the bench nearest the heat, and began the process of locating dry food and a warm drink in a kitchen that was not yet staffed for the morning shift. He watched her with his mother's eyes, the pale brown quiet eyes of a child who had learned not to make requests, and said, "She can't get up today." Mira said, "I know." She did not explain how she knew. She put a bread piece and a cup of warmed broth in front of him and said, "Eat first." He ate. She went to Dale's room when the day kitchen staff arrived to take over the bench watch. She had, she acknowledged, no plan more sophisticated than that. But when she reached Dale's room and saw the woman's coloring and the shallow rhythm of her breathing, and when she pressed the back of her unblistered hand against the woman's forehead and felt the particular temperature that accompanied silver toxicity in its middle stages, the calculation expanded. There was one thing she could do that no one else in this keep could do, not because of knowledge, though the knowledge helped, but because of what she was. A wolf with silver tolerance could neutralize a silver sickness environment, not by healing the affected wolf directly, but by physically handling and removing the source material, the contaminated pipe fixtures, and the silver alloy cookware that the quartermaster had issued to the junior section, without the protection gloves that every other wolf in the keep would need, and that were, she checked, not available in sufficient quantity in the lower supply room. She spent 6 hours in Dale's section of the keep. She pulled 3 pipe fixtures barehanded. She replaced them, provisionally, with standard iron equivalents she requisitioned from the maintenance stores, with a written request that she signed, with the name of a senior maintenance worker, whose signature she had seen enough times to reproduce accurately. Not forgery for gain, she told herself, which was technically true, and also the kind of technical truth that she was aware was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. She removed and disposed of the contaminated cookware. She scrubbed the room. She did all of it quietly, during the mid-morning hours, when the junior keep section was largely empty, because its residents were at their work assignments. Her hands, at the end of it, were the same as they had been at the start. No marks, no redness. Cool to her own touch and foreign, slightly, in the way they always felt to her when she had been handling silver for an extended period. Not painful, but aware of itself, a low-level hum beneath the skin that she had never quite found words for. She did not find words for it. She washed her hands at the lower kitchen pump, retrieved Fen from the morning kitchen staff who had been feeding him a second breakfast in a spirit of collective good nature, and walked him back to his mother's room, which now smelled of iron and cold air, rather than the faintly acrid undertone that silver-sick environments developed over time. Dale was still unconscious, but the color in her face, over the following 3 days, improved. Mira watched from the corridor, during the morning walk-pasts that her hall service route required. She did not go in again. She did not need to. What she had not accounted for, the single operational error in the 6 weeks that followed, the fracture line she had not seen because she was watching the room and not the corridor behind her, was that the keep's maintenance supervisor would notice the requisitioned materials, notice the signature, and take it to Lord Casson, because Casson ran the inner keep's operational budget and the maintenance supervisor reported to him. She found this out on a cold Friday evening in early winter, 31 days after the pipe replacement, when Casson appeared at the entrance to the serving alcove during the evening's smaller household dinner, and told her, quietly and with the flat tone of a man who had decided how a conversation would end before it started, that she was to appear in the Beta's administrative chamber at 6th bell the following morning. "The requisition in Pellin's name," he said. He meant the maintenance supervisor. "You want to explain that before I do?" Mira said. "Yes, my lord." He looked at her hands, the same look Theron had almost completed, 43 days before that evening, except Casson completed his look without difficulty, because Casson had none of Theron's trained control over his own attention. He looked at her hands, and his brow drew together, not yet at the conclusion, but approaching it, the way a man approaches a door he hasn't opened yet. She kept her face neutral. "6th bell," he said, and moved on. She returned to the water pitchers. Her hands were steady. The hum beneath the skin was, she noted, slightly louder than usual this evening, though there was no silver in the serving alcove, and had not been since she had quietly reorganized the alcove's equipment 3 years ago. She did not know why it was louder. She would understand later. At the far end of the table, in the high seat that no one else used, Theron sat with 3 Northern Pack advisors and turned his cup in one slow rotation without drinking from it. The Beta's administrative chamber was a square, cold room on the upper keep's 3rd level, furnished for intimidation, the way all administrative chambers in hierarchical pack structures were furnished. The Beta's chair elevated slightly on a stone dais, the petitioner's position on open floor with no seat offered, the window placed to put morning light in the petitioner's eyes. Mira stood in the petitioner's position and let the light do what it intended. Casson sat in the elevated chair and opened the requisition record on the table before him. He was not angry, precisely. He was the colder version of anger, the version that had moved through the emotional register and arrived at administrative. He laid one thick finger on the signature line. "This is Pellin's name," he said, "in your hand." "Yes, my lord." "Forgery. Technically." His eyes came up from the document. "The note I left for Archivist Sereth 6 weeks before that concerned the pipe alloy in the junior section," she said. "If that note had been acted on, the requisition would have been made through the correct channel. It was not acted on. The woman in the junior section was dying. That is not how this keep runs. No, my lord. How this keep runs, the woman would have been dying for another 6 weeks before the correct channel produced a result, and by that time she would have been dead. The silence in the room was different from the banquet hall silence. Less public, more focused. "You are an unranked Omega," Casson said, and it was not a question. It was a reminder. Not unkind, simply structural, the kind of thing said to a person who appears to have forgotten what category they occupy. "Yes, my lord." "Who has been accessing the records annex?" She had not expected that one. She showed nothing. "I assist Archivist Sereth with the upper shelves. I have done so for 4 years. And reading the documents on those upper shelves. Sereth asked me to check labels. I am thorough. You read the pipe alloy contract. I read the supply manifests. The alloy specification was in a footnote." Casson looked at her for a long time. The look was not hostile. It was the look of a man recalibrating, which was in some ways more dangerous than hostility, because recalibration was a form of attention that did not easily stop once it started. "Your hands," he said. "My lord?" "At the autumn banquet. The wine was hot. I know it was hot. I felt the steam from the carafe. Your hands are not scarred." The wine reached the floor, not my hands. "No," he said, "it did not." She held his gaze. "And the pipe fixtures," he said. Iron pipe fixtures pulled with bare hands from a silver alloy joint require gloves because the contact point is still silver adjacent. Pellin would have used gloves. Any wolf would have used gloves. He paused. There were no gloves requisitioned. Mira said nothing. "What are you?" Casson said. It was not unkind. It was genuinely curious, which was worse. "An unranked Omega from Ashfen," she said, "in service at Ironhold Keep for 4 years. that is your designation. Yes, my lord. I asked what you are. She looked at the window. The light was winter pale, thin and honest, the kind of light that did not favor either of them. She thought of her mother's folded paper in the pocket of her grey dress, worn thin at the creases. She thought of the document in the wrong case in the annex, the one she had read 3 years ago and returned without moving. She thought of Fen, who had been eating a second breakfast last she heard, and whose mother's color was continuing to improve. She said, "I am what I am, my lord. I am not certain that question has an answer I am in a position to give." Casson sat back. Then he said, flatly, "I am taking this to the king." She had known it was coming. She had known it from the Tuesday she pulled the first pipe fixture, the way she knew all the things she knew, exactly, structurally, without surprise, but not without weight. "Yes, my lord," she said. The inquiry before Theron was set for the following morning. She spent the night in the lower kitchen with Sereth, who had heard about the summons through the keep's intricate social network and had arrived at her service station during the evening cleanup, looking like a man who felt he owed a debt he had not thought to feel until very recently. He did not ask her many questions. He made tea, which was a practical form of solidarity, and sat with her in the warm kitchen while she prepared the morning bread portions 2 hours earlier than necessary, because she needed something to do with her hands. "The note you left me," he said finally, "about the pipes." She looked at him. "I did file it," he said, "under public works, as you guessed. I could have placed it differently. You had no reason to think it was a medical document." "I had no reason to think many things," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been an archivist in this keep for 31 years. I have never met an Omega who could read a silver alloy specification in a contract footnote and understand its health implications. The medical connection is in a supplemental record filed under the old health codes, cross-referenced in the annex's secondary index. The cross-reference is not obvious." "No," he said, "it is not." He looked at his tea. "What will you tell the king?" Mira said, "The truth." "All of it?" She considered. "Enough of it." He nodded, as if this were not only a reasonable answer, but the one he had expected. She finished the bread portions. The kitchen was warm and smelled of yeast and iron. Outside the keep's deep walls, the winter night pressed down with the particular weight of the northern reach in its coldest season, and she could hear, very distantly, the sound of wind across the wall. She did not sleep. She did not attempt to. She thought about her mother's paper, folded in its pocket. She thought about the old seal and the document in the wrong case. She thought about 31 years that Sereth had spent in the annex, and had never, he had just told her, met an Omega who could trace a cross-reference that was not obvious. She was what she was. Her mother had said it first, and she had been saying it to herself in one form or another for 18 years, and she still did not have a clean version of what that meant. She had one night left, in which not knowing was still safe. She used it to bake bread. Before the inquiry reached Theron, before anyone outside of Casson's administrative circle knew enough to begin asking the structural question the pipe fixtures implied, the winter provided a secondary crisis that forced the order of events. The fever came into the lower keep on a Tuesday. Not silver sickness this time, but a genuine midwinter contagion, the respiratory kind that moved through crowded quarters, the way fire moved through dry rooms, steadily and without favorites. By the 3rd day, it had reached the junior wing and the secondary servant quarters, and by the 5th day, it had reached the household staff children's room, where Fen and 7 other young children of keep residents. Mira heard about the fever through the morning kitchen reports. She heard everything through the morning kitchen, which was the keep's most reliable information exchange, more current than the advisory chamber, and more honest than the guard reports. She heard, specifically, that Fen had developed a high fever overnight, and that Dale, who was improving but not yet strong, had been moved to the medical ward 3 days earlier as a precaution when the first fever cases appeared, and that the children's room had only one overnight attendant now, a young woman who had also begun running a temperature. She heard this at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before the inquiry was scheduled. She went to the children's room first. The attendant was in her cot, with her coat on, which was the specific configuration of a person who had tried to keep working until their body made the argument they had been losing. She was not dangerously ill. Her temperature was elevated but not alarming, and she was aware enough to tell Mira, with the particular gratitude of someone who had been alone and unwell in a cold room for 2 hours, exactly which children had the highest temperatures and which had been coughing. Fen was one of the high temperatures. He was asleep in the middle cot, the one with the best blanket coverage, because the attendant had clearly thought to arrange this before her own strength gave out, and Mira felt something firm and specific in her chest that was not sentiment, but was adjacent to it. She could not do for a fever what she could do for silver sickness. She had no extraordinary tolerance for viral contagion. She was simply harder to damage than most wolves, for reasons that her mother had explained only partially, but a child's fever was not her particular kind of problem to solve. What she could do was stay. She sent word to the medical ward to come to the children's room rather than waiting for transfers, which was more efficient. She found the second supply of medicinal bark tea in the kitchen annex stores, the supply that was not in the obvious location, but that she had read the inventory list for 17 months ago and could therefore locate correctly, and she made 2 large pots of it. She made sure every child who was awake and capable of drinking drank. She checked the ones who were asleep every 15 minutes with the back of her unblistered hand. The medical staff arrived an hour later. They were competent and tired and had more cases than they had people for, and they absorbed the organization Mira had established with the pragmatic gratitude of the genuinely overwhelmed. At 7th bell, an hour past the scheduled inquiry time, a guard appeared at the children's room door. Mira was seated on the low stool between Fen's cot and the cot of a 5-year-old girl who had graduated from high fever to merely elevated and was demanding, quietly but persistently, a story. The guard looked at the room. He looked at Mira. He looked at the guard's notice in his hand, which presumably said, "Retrieve Omega, designation unranked, for the delayed inquiry before the Alpha King." He said, "The king is asking for you." Mira said, to the 5-year-old, "I will finish the story when I come back." She looked at the guard. "Give me 3 minutes." The guard looked uncertain about 3 minutes. She was already at the wash basin. She was clean, which relative to the morning she had been managing was a meaningful accomplishment. Her dress was gray and wine-free, and her hair was in its low knot. Her hands, the guard had looked at them, she noticed, in the doorway, in the specific way people now looked at her hands in this keep, which told her that Cassin had been talking. The Alpha King's receiving room was not the throne chamber. It was smaller, a working room, used for administrative meetings, with a long rectangular table and windows that looked north over the wall. The room smelled of cold stone and cedar wood and the particular clean mineral scent of a high dominance wolf whose control was excellent but not total. She registered the scent before she registered anything visual, which was not usual for her. She was not a scent-forward person, generally speaking. She catalogued it as relevant and moved on. Theron was standing, not seated. This was not a ceremony. Cassin was present, standing to the left of the table, his expression professionally neutral. Sereth was also present, which she had not expected, sitting in one of the chairs with his hands folded, and the look of a man who had volunteered for something. Theron looked at her when she entered, not at her hands, at her face, which was the look of a man who had already been briefed about the hands, and was now forming his own assessment of what accompanied them. He said, "You were in the children's room." "Yes, my lord king." "How many cases?" 8 children. 2 with high fevers that concern me, 5 with moderate temperatures that should resolve in 2 days with the bark tea protocol. 1 who was elevated this morning, but has already come down. The attendant is ill, but not seriously. The medical staff has them now. He studied her. Casson tells me you pulled silver alloy pipe fixtures barehanded. Yes. Show me your hands. She held them out, palms up, the same hands that had gripped the silver-chased carafe for 20 minutes at the autumn banquet, the same hands that had pulled 3 pipe fixtures without gloves, the same hands that the scalding wine had failed to mark. He crossed the room, which she had not expected him to do. He was tall and broad in the northern wolf way, white-skinned, dark-haired, the physical specificity of his lineage visible in the sharp structure of his face and the sun-warmed tone of his skin that came not from any ancestry, but from the kind of outdoor northern life that a king who ran patrol routes on foot rather than horseback developed over time. He stopped in front of her at a distance that was close enough for her to register that his scent was not only cedar, but something warmer and older beneath it, something she did not have a material word for, except that it made the hum beneath her skin increase sharply, the hum she associated with silver proximity and had not, until this moment, associated with anything else. She kept her hands out, steady. He looked at them for a long time. He did not touch them. His wolf, in the part of him that the man kept behind the administrative surface, had already been looking at her. Not since this morning, since the autumn banquet, 43 days ago, when she had turned her knuckles inward before he could complete the look, and the scent of scalded wine had failed to carry any undertone of burned skin. He had noticed it that night. He had told himself he had noticed it and would pursue the administrative question at an appropriate time, which was how he managed his instincts generally, by assigning them to a future appointment. But the scent had stayed. Not her scent specifically. He had not been close enough in the banquet hall to catalogue her scent. What had stayed was the absence of the pain scent that should have been there. That absence had the shape of something. He had been turning that shape over in the back of his mind for 43 days and had not yet arrived at a name for it. Now, in this room, at this distance, the shape acquired a name. Her scent was not a serving omega scent. It was not unranked. Whatever it was not that, and his wolf was not interested in waiting for the administrative record to catch up with what the wolf had already concluded. The word the wolf would have used, if he had allowed it the full volume of its opinion, was something he did not allow full volume in administrative meetings. He stepped back. He was a man of considerable practiced restraint. "Tell me about Ashfen," he said. She looked at him directly, which was notable because she had not looked at him directly yet. Her eyes were bark brown and very level. She said, "Ashfen is a border settlement 2 days east of the wall. My mother lived there. She died there. I was sent to Ironhold through the assignment lottery at 18. "Your mother." "Yes, my Lord King." Her name. A pause. The first pause she had given. She used the name Lyret when she came to Ashfen. "When she came to Ashfen," he repeated. "Not a name she was born with." Mira said nothing. Theron turned to Sereth. "You have been employing this woman in the annex for 4 years. "She assists me," Sereth said carefully. "She reads." A pause. "Yes. What does she read?" Sereth met his gaze with the courage of a 31-year archivist who had decided that this morning was the morning he paid a debt. "Everything, my Lord King. She reads everything." The room was very still. Mira reached into the pocket of her grey dress. She unfolded the paper slowly, the thin paper with its worn creases, and she held it out toward the Alpha King with the same steadiness she had held out her hands, not without cost. The cost was simply internal and invisible, which was where she put everything that had a cost. Theron took it. He looked at it for a long time. The room waited. The old seal, the old bloodline notation, the name that was written there, in brown ink that had not faded, because it had been written on better paper than the keep's ledger, and because the woman who had written it had understood that it needed to last. He said, "Where did you get this?" "My mother gave it to me," Mira said, "before she died." "Your mother, who used the name Liret when she came to Ashfen?" "Yes, and her name before Ashfen." Mira met his gaze. 8 years of looking for the answer to this question, 3 years of knowing the answer, and standing here now with it, was not relief. It was the very specific feeling of a thing that has been held for a very long time, finally being put down, and the muscles not entirely knowing what to do with the absence of the weight. "I know where the document is," she said. "The one that explains it. It is in the annex. It has been misfiled under the wrong case heading for at least 11 years. I did not remove it, because it was not mine to remove." Theron looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned to Casson and said, "Cancel the inquiry. Set a new appointment. Bring Sereth and the annex access record." He looked back at Mira. "You will come with me." Casson said, "My lord, she is an unranked Omega." "She is nothing of the kind," Theron said. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. Casson went quiet. And in the doorway, where 2 junior advisors had been hovering throughout the exchange, Mira watched the specific ripple pass through them, the small physical stillness, the downward flick of eyes, the micro-adjustment of posture that wolves made when the biological reality of a situation arrived before the formal announcement. They had not heard the document's contents. They did not need to. The scent in the room had already told them something the administrative record would take another 2 days to confirm. Mira straightened the worn fold of her paper, which Theron had returned to her with both hands rather than one, which was not an accident, and she followed the Alpha King out of the room. The annex document took 11 minutes to locate once Sereth opened the case, and Mira pointed to the misfiled position. It took another hour for the Keep's senior legal reader to authenticate it. The seal, the bloodline notation, the secondary witness marks that confirmed provenance. Theron stood at the table throughout, reading the document himself, which was notable because Alpha Kings typically received summaries rather than primary sources. He read it twice. He set it down. He looked at Mira, who was standing across the table, and said, "You have known this for 3 years." "Yes, my Lord King." "And you told no one." "I was unranked. The information would have been filed under the wrong heading." Something moved in his face, briefly. Not amusement, she was certain it was not amusement, but a flicker of recognition, a man who had spent his reign managing information in a keep that consistently misfiled things of consequence, hearing this. "Your mother," he said. "She left the capital with this document." "She kept a copy," Mira said. "The original remained in the annex. She believed it was safer there than with her." "She was right." He paused. "She was protecting you." "Yes." "By keeping you unranked and invisible." "Yes." "For 22 years. She died when I was 14, Mira said quietly. "The latter 8 years were my own management." He was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table beside the document. They were large hands, a working Alpha's hands, scarred in the way of a man who had trained and patrolled rather than only presided. And they were very still on the table surface, in the way that things were still when a person was actively preventing them from moving. "The silver tolerance," he said. "It comes with what I am," she said. "It has always been present. Since childhood. Since the first memory I have that involves cookpots." He looked at her for a moment with the look she was beginning to recognize as his complete attention rather than his administrative attention. They were different, she was finding, in ways she had not expected to be finding tonight. "You are not afraid of me," he said. It was not a question. "No, my Lord King. Most people are. I have read a great deal of documentation about your administrative decisions for 3 years, she said. "I find you methodical and fair. That is not frightening." The flicker came back, briefly. This time she was less certain it was not what she had first ruled out. "Methodical and fair," he said. "Yes. That is not what people usually say." "What do they usually say?" "Formidable," he said. "Terrifying. Relentless." "Those are also accurate," she said. "They are not, however, the aspects that determine whether a person is worth being afraid of." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, to Sereth, without looking away from her, "Get me the bloodline charter." The full one, not the administrative summary. Sereth, who had been a very quiet presence in the corner of the annex for the last hour, said, "Yes, my Lord King," in the tone of a man who felt very correct about the morning's choices. The charter confirmed what the misfiled document had already established. The legal reading took 2 days, during which Mira continued her hall service because Theron had told her, privately and without ceremony, at the end of the annex session, that she should continue her ordinary duties until the formalities were complete, and that she should tell him immediately if anyone in the keep treated her differently in the interim. No one treated her differently. No one knew, officially, but the junior advisors who had been in the doorway had apparently been less discreet about their involuntary behavioral tells than they imagined, because by the second morning there was a quality of careful attention around Mira's service route that had not existed before. Doors held, the water pitcher never allowed to run low enough to require her to go back to the kitchen, a kind of ambient pack awareness that was registering something in her scent before the formal word had been given. She noticed it. She said nothing about it. She served water and kept the pitchers full. On the second evening, Theron came to the serving alcove. Not to the alcove in a requesting sense. He was simply in that section of the hall, standing near the east wall, in the way of a man who has found a reason to be somewhere that does not require explanation. She was the only other person in the alcove at that moment, the other servers having gone to the kitchen for the next course. He stood 3 feet from her, which was closer than an Alpha King typically stood, to a serving Omega in a public hall. The hum in her skin was, she noted, at a level she had never experienced before, not unpleasant, but undeniable, a resonance she could feel in the site below her left collarbone, that she had no name for, except that it matched, she realized with a precision that surprised her, the distance between them. He said quietly, "Are you well?" She said, "Yes." The children's room. "The 2 high-temperature cases came down this morning. Fen is eating again." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I was in the administrative meeting yesterday, and Casson reported that you had been in the children's room, that you had stayed the night, I thought of the banquet, the wine." She waited. "I should have said something then," he said, "about the wine." "There was nothing to say, my Lord King. My hands were fine." "They should not have been." He looked at them, her hands resting on the edge of the pitcher, with the look that had been the beginning of everything, the look that could not now be taken back. "Casson poured wine on you in front of the full table, and I sat there and said nothing." "You set down your cup," she said. He looked at her. "I noticed," she said. "You set it down and you looked. That was enough." It was not enough. No, she agreed, because she did not lie to him, she was finding. But it was something. And you are here now. He was close enough that she could see the exact degree of control he was holding around the stillness of his hands, the hands that had gone flat on the table in the annex, that were now loose at his sides, in the deliberate way of a man who has decided how his hands are going to behave, and is maintaining that decision through effort. She understood, from everything she had read, and everything she was beginning to feel with a specificity she had not prepared for, exactly what that effort cost. She said, "The charter formalities are complete tomorrow." "Yes. And then this is no longer a private matter." "No," he said, "it will not be." He paused. "I want you to know that what happens tomorrow is not only administrative, for me. The hum below her collarbone was very loud now. She had 22 years of practice at keeping things internal, and she was using all of it. "I have been methodical and fair," he said, and there was something in his voice that was dry and warm at the same time, the first warmth she had heard in it. "You said so yourself." She looked at him. "I may have understated the case slightly." This time there was no ambiguity about the flicker. He said, "Tomorrow, then." She said, "Tomorrow." He returned to the table. She watched the Eastern picture for the remainder of the service, and her hands were steady, and the hum did not quiet for the rest of the evening. The formal assembly was held in the throne chamber at mid-morning, which was not the keep's ordinary schedule for bloodline announcements, but which Theron had arranged as a deliberate signal. Mid-morning was when the full court was present, advisors, pack elders, visiting delegates, and the senior household staff, which included the serving personnel, which meant the room reflected the keep's complete social architecture, from its highest-ranking member to its lowest. Mira stood at the back of the room, in the position of household staff, in her grey dress. Casson read the charter findings aloud, in his official beta's voice, which was precise and without inflection, and carried all the way to the rear of the chamber without requiring her to strain. She had read the findings herself. She did not need to hear them to know what they said. What she had not anticipated was the wolves. She had anticipated the words. She had anticipated the legal logic, the bloodline confirmation, the charter terms. She had not fully anticipated what happened to a room full of wolves when a biological truth of this magnitude was formally announced, and their instincts, which had already been running quiet calculations for 48 hours, were given permission to complete themselves. The ripple was not a metaphor. It was a physical thing that moved from the front of the room to the back like a current, a wave of stillness, of averted eyes, of posture adjustments, of the small, involuntary deferences that pack hierarchy produced at the instinctive level before the conscious mind had processed the reason for them. It reached the back of the room, where Mira stood, approximately 4 seconds after Casson finished reading. The senior pack elder to her left stepped back. It was a small step, perhaps 3 inches, and he appeared only distantly aware of having taken it. But he had moved, and it was away from her, and the direction of movement had the specific geometry of a wolf, creating clearance for a superior. The junior advisor from the doorway, the one who had been watching for 48 hours, was standing 12 feet away, and he turned toward her, with his chin lowered, which was not a bow in any formal sense, but was something older and more involuntary than a bow. She stood in grey linen, with her low knot and her bark-brown eyes, and she watched the room recalibrate around her, without movement or expression. At the front of the chamber, Theron was standing beside the throne, rather than in it. He had told her this the previous evening, during the last of the private briefings, that he would stand beside it, not in it, because this was not a coronation, this was a recognition. The difference mattered to him, and she had understood why it mattered, and had not said so, and he had known she understood, without requiring her to say it, which was a form of communication she was rapidly adjusting to. Casson finished the formal portion. The chamber held its specific quality of rearranged silence. Theron spoke then, not from the throne, not from the dais. He walked from the front of the chamber toward the back, through the assembled court, which parted for him without being asked, in the way that water parts for something moving through it with certainty. He walked the length of the room, and he stopped in front of Mira. The room was entirely still, he said, not loudly, in the voice he used for things that did not require volume, because the room had arranged itself to hear them. Mira of Ashfen, daughter of Liret, who was born here and kept a document safe for 20 years so that her daughter could be what she is. He said her name. It was the first time she had heard it from him, and it arrived with a weight she had not expected, which was ironic, given that she had been cataloguing the weights of most things for 22 years. "I have been looking at the wrong ledger," he said, For 4 years you have been in this keep, and the record listed you as unranked. That is not what the bloodline record says. That is not what every wolf in this room currently knows. It is not what I know." He held out his hand. She looked at it. His hand, palm up, the scarred working hand of a man who had been methodical and fair, and perhaps somewhat more than those things. The hum below her collarbone was, at this proximity, no longer something she was managing. It was simply present, as constant and factual as her heartbeat, the thing that had been there since she entered the room, since the autumn banquet, since whatever moment it had decided to be true. She placed her hand in his. The room made a sound that was not quite a sound, a collective exhale, a shifting of weight, the biological response of 60 wolves witnessing a bond declare itself in the oldest way available to it. Casson, who had poured wine on her hands 55 days ago and had not apologized, stood to the left of the throne, with his expression carefully professional and his posture 3 degrees more formal than usual, which was, she decided, the version of an apology that a beta of his type was capable of offering in public. She accepted it, because she was practical. Theron's fingers closed around hers. He turned to face the room. He did not announce it. He did not need to. Every wolf in the chamber had already known for the last 30 seconds. The mark was not immediate. There was a great deal of keep business that intervened between the morning of the recognition and the evening when the formal bonding was complete. Charter logistics, housing changes, a conversation with Sereth about the annex's misfiling conventions that she conducted with the same attention she would have given it in any other context, because the annex was still the annex, and the wrong-headed files were still wrong. Dale was moved to better quarters with Fen and had recovered enough to be embarrassed about the amount of help she had accepted from an unranked stranger, which Mira resolved by simply referring to it in the past tense and moving forward. Casson did not apologize formally. He did, however, stop by the serving alcove on the evening of the second day after the recognition and leave a sealed document on the alcove's service shelf, the original complaint about the pipe alloy requisition, withdrawn and marked as closed. It was, she thought, a reasonable thing. The bond formalized on the 7th day. Theron had asked her, privately and on the second night, how long she needed. She had said 6 days, which was not an arbitrary number. 6 days was how long it would take her to complete and file the corrected cross-references in the annex, so that the misfiled document would never land in the wrong case again. He had looked at her and said, 6 days. He had said it in the tone of a man who found this answer entirely consistent with everything he had been learning about her for the last week, and who had decided he was not surprised. On the 7th evening, in the north-facing study that was now also her room and her workspace, in the light of the fire that had been built up against the winter outside, Theron sat across from her at the table she had already stacked with reference documents, and said, "You will never stop working. You are the same," she said. He considered this. "Yes," he said, "I am." The mark was his, and the warmth of it was specific and permanent, a constant low-level resonance below her left collarbone that matched the hum she had spent 22 years attributing to silver proximity, and now understood, had been waiting for a different explanation all along. He said, later, with the fire lower and the winter pressing at the north window, the banquet, the night Casson. "I know," she said. "I was looking at your hands. I know. I turned them. I noticed that too." He was quiet for a moment. "I told myself I would pursue the question at an appropriate time, and then 43 days went by. Yes, you were being methodical," she said. "I was being afraid," he said, which was a different kind of answer, and she looked at him, of being wrong, about what the absence of pain scent meant. She was quiet for a moment. "Were you wrong?" "No," he said. "I was not." She looked at the fire. "Neither was I," she said. "About what you were, when I read the documents." He turned to look at her. Methodical and fair were accurate, she said, but they were not the whole record. What was the rest of the record? She thought about it. A man who walked the length of a room through a ranked court to stand in front of someone in a grey dress. A hand held out, palm up, without ceremony. A cup set down 43 days before that, quietly, because wine had been poured on someone and the room had been silent. The rest of the record, she said, is why I stayed. He said nothing. He put one hand over hers on the table, and the fire moved with the draught from the north window, and outside, the winter was still pressing down with all its northern weight, ordinary and unchanged, as it had been pressing down for 22 years before this night, and would press down for 22 more. Fen recovered fully by the end of winter, and developed, in the spring, an extremely persistent interest in the record's annex that Sereth found exhausting, and Mira found entirely understandable. She let him sit on the lower step of the annex ladder and pass reference documents up to her while she worked the upper shelves, because someone had to correct the secondary index, and the old archivist's knees were only getting worse. He was 4 by then, and already learning to read labels. She was patient with the questions, which were numerous, and showed a gratifying disregard for what a 4-year-old was assumed to be capable of understanding. One afternoon in early spring, he looked up at her from the bottom step and said, "Why is the moon seal different from the king's seal?" She came down from the upper step and sat beside him on the lower one, and showed him, in the document he was holding, exactly why the seals were different and what each one meant. He listened with the total, unblinking attention of a child who has not yet learned which things he is supposed to find boring. Outside the annex window, the keep's north yard was thawing. The light came in, pale and honest through the old glass, the same winter-thin light that did not favor anyone. She showed him the cross-reference. He traced it with one small finger, carefully, the way she had traced it herself in another spring, 3 years ago, standing on this same ladder, in a grey dress with a secret in her pocket. She had no secret in her pocket now, just the worn fold lines of the old paper, which she still carried because she was not ready to stop carrying it, and which Theron understood without requiring explanation, because he was. She had not been wrong about this. The whole record had confirmed it. The kind of man who understood which things did not need to be explained. Fen looked up at her. "Can you show me the other one too?" "Yes," she said, "I can." She turned to the next page.